So take two. Can you hear me? It's right close. Welcome. I'm so glad you could be here with us this evening. Welcome to everybody who's joining us online. I'm Michelle Seifola. I'm the Programming and Marketing Director from the Hudson Area Library. And this is Police Voices in the Valley. This is our 6th installment in the Voices in the Valley series. We want to say thank you to Hop and Barrel for being such a wonderful partner in this program and hosting us this evening. And thank you to both of you for being here this evening, participating, and sharing with us. We're going to have you both come up and introduce yourselves, tell us a little about yourselves, and then take turns answering the questions. The first question is, what is the hardest part of your job?
You want to start first?
Good. We are going to try this, actually.
Okay.
We're going to try and roll this way, see how that works. Jeff Willems, I'm the Chief of Police in Hudson. I've been in Hudson for about 13 years, been the chief for 3 before that. I had the pleasure of working with Mark in North Hudson for about 5 years. So, first question, what's the most difficult part of our jobs? Probably the different things you see. The traumas to families, the traumas that we experience ourselves. Everybody thinks of the violent crashes and the violence that you encounter, but I think the trauma goes much deeper than that when after the fact, right? I mean, we're trained how to deal with everything in the moment, but 20 years ago, we weren't really trained in how to deal with it after the fact. So how to keep your bucket from overflowing, so to speak, is probably the most difficult part of the job. Overall, I would say most recently, the most difficult part would be the political part of the job, where the media portrays us in a certain way and realizing, or us not thinking that's very fair, that there's a big part of the story that's missing. So for that, I'm grateful to be here tonight. I'm grateful that you all took the time out of your days to be here, to give us that opportunity to kind of talk about the things that the normal person doesn't really correlate with law enforcement.
So I'll start with my introduction. I'm Mark Richards. I'm the Chief of Police in North Hudson. I've been an officer in North Hudson for a little over 21 years. Before that, had worked some part-time jobs in Somerset, in St. Croix County, and North Hudson as a part-time officer. I am part of a 5-person department. We're a small agency. You'll see that my uniform looks a little bit different than Jeff's, but for the most part, we do the same job. I just often say, as a small agency, I take calls during the day, calls for service and whatnot, and so kind of adds on to some of the things that I do on a day-to-day basis. As part of my introduction, I want to thank my family and friends that came tonight to support me, and for all of you for showing up to listen to the two of us. Hopefully we have information that you're going to learn that you didn't know about what it is to be an officer. We did get these questions in advance, and so a couple of my answers might be super long because I've tried to build in the opportunity to explain things. A lot of times when we do presentations or you see things in the media or you see things on TV, it's a 10-second blurb and you don't really understand a lot of what got us to that point. And so I'm going to try my best to explain some of those things today and give good examples. The community that I work for is 3,800 people. It's mostly residential, and so a lot of my examples probably fit that, but I can tell you that both of our jurisdictions in the city of Hudson and the village of North Hudson, we deal with everything that you can think of. If you think of a stabbing, I think there was one this past weekend. If you think of the crash that the city of Hudson had where there was 2 people injured by a drunk driver, it's not just those things that happen in big cities. All of that does come over, and we experience that as well and have to deal with those traumas. So a couple of things, the caveats that I'll start with before I even tell any of my stories is that some of my stories might be hard to hear. I apologize if anyone here is hurt or traumatized by that, but I need you to understand what we go through and what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. 21 years on the job, I've got a lot of baggage. That bucket that he talked about, I've probably overflowed that multiple times. So I'm going to talk about that tonight. So I apologize, it's going to be real talk. I'm not going to talk about any specific case. You're not going to hear a person's name, so don't worry. I'm not going to be, disclosing anything that I shouldn't. But I appreciate you all attending because hopefully you'll learn something. So the hardest part of our job, Jeff hit it on the head. It's the traumas. It's those things that we have to deal with after the fact. It seems odd because you'd think that maybe the hardest part would be making an arrest or having to use force or those types of things. And all of those are in the moment, and as Jeff mentioned, we train for that. We expect that those things are going to be coming. So my initial thought was suicide responses. I know that when I went through recruit school, there were some things that I learned. It was 400 hours back then. We were way back in the day. But we learned a lot, but we didn't learn everything. And so I remember being on my first suicide. It was a hanging. The subject had hung himself, and I responded to the scene. Obviously, this person there was not going to be any help for him, and the medical examiner shows up, and he comes in, does his thing, and at some point looks at me and says, "Okay, you hold the body. I'll cut the rope." And I kind of did me? They didn't tell me that in recruit school. They didn't talk about that would be something that we would do. Well, to hold a body when the rope gets cut and the weight of that body and all of those things traumatized me for a while. I lost some sleep for a couple of nights because that was not something that I put in the wheelhouse of what we were going to be doing. We move into the domestic abuse cases that we have. Trauma that includes children, the things that children hear and see that we never realize affects them, but we then see some of the things through their eyes that they saw, or the spouses or other family members, and how we have to then take that home and go to our families and try to act normal. I often tell the story about, you come home from work, you've had a child abuse case that you worked on, maybe you saw an accident where there was a lot of gore, maybe somebody died, you have the suicide, you walk in the door and your wife or your kids say, "Hey Dad, how was your day?" Do you dump all that on them? Or do you say, "It was great, had a great day, thanks for asking"? So there's a lot of things that we have to try to deal with as far as traumas that go on for a long time. I think of a child pornography case that I had where you probably don't know this, and maybe you do. The court cannot watch child pornography videos. They can only read reports or read documents. So in order to do a search warrant for a child pornography case, the investigator, me, has to watch child pornography. I don't want to do that, never wanted to do that, didn't realize that was going to be a part of my job when I first started, but I have to watch and then type descriptions of what this person is doing to this child. And again, go home and hug my 7-year-old or hug my 12-year-old and try to distance myself from all of that ish. And that took a long time, and that takes a long time. So these are examples of things that you're not going to hear about in a lot of other places that we wanted to bring as real talk, real life, because it are things that affect us as human beings. I was just part of a Lexapol webinar that I watched. The statistic that they threw out that hit me kind of hard was an officer can experience 188 traumatic events in the course of their employment. The typical person will only deal with 1 to 2 in their lifetime. So in our 25 to 30 years of service, we're going to be dealing with all of these traumatic experiences where the typical person deals with 1 or 2, and how do they deal with it? Did they do well in how they handled it? When I was talking with my wife and we were talking about some of the things that I was going to be answering today, one of the things that I recall is that I am not the same person today that I was 21 years ago when I started this job. It has hardened me. It has made me a better person. I definitely have a lot of real positive things that I've gotten from this profession, and I enjoy getting up every day and going to work, but I am not the same happy-go-lucky person that I was 21 years ago. And so it does change kind of your perspective on the world and somewhat cynicism, to be quite honest. The last thing I'll talk about, my answer to this one, the St. Croix County Sheriff's Office has a chaplain program, and every couple of years they bring in a speaker. His organization's called Breach Point, but he's a retired chief from the Chicagoland area. And he does speeches and instruction on trauma and how it affects law enforcement and how we have to be able to get through it. One of the things that he uses as his term for how he defines a police officer. Now, it's a cop talking to a bunch of cops, so we all get this, but I think it's important to hear. He defines us as pessimistic, non-trusting control freaks that fight change and assess blame. That's our job. If we didn't have that perspective going into the job, it would be difficult to do. But on the backside of that, he also talks about the fact that law enforcement officers have two phobias. The two phobias are trusting too much and controlling too little. Because what happens if one of those things doesn't go right? Someone dies, most oftentimes an officer, or gets hurt or injured in those types of things. So we have phobias of trusting too much and controlling too little, and we wear all that on our vest, on our face, and then we go home and we cross that threshold into our households. And we control too, and we have the phobias of trusting too much and controlling too little. When your 16-year-old comes to you and says, hey, I'm going out with this boy, I know too much about what happens when 16-year-olds go out with that boy. And so you put on this, it's not a real happy face. And my 22-year-old daughter's in the room, so if anybody wants to contest to that, she can tell you it's not always the easiest thing to deal with. Luckily, I have a wife who is amazing and can be my polar opposite when some of these things happen. But how do you do that? How do you take that and move it into your family and not realize that not all mall Santas are child molesters? I mean, a lot of them are. And so then you just kind of put that, well, if that person is, then all the rest of them must be. And so we have to really try to break through. In this breach point training, they talk a lot about trying to break through and have that breach point where you can walk through the door, and it looks like Jeff has his on. You can snap out of it. He's got a wristband or a wrist, I don't know what you call it, bracelet that's rubberized, and you can snap it, and basically it's that physical remembrance of you have to snap out of where you're at, you're going into your family setting, you're going into your friend's setting, and you have to be able to release some of those toxins that you've dealt with all day.
Oh, yeah. In Hudson, North Hudson, and St. Croix County, what are the most challenging problems from the perspective of law enforcement? Drugs, weapons, mental health?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's pretty obvious to us, but probably not to many of you. I would say that both drugs and mental health kind of go together. They are both the biggest thing that we deal with. In some cases, you have someone suffering from mental health that's not able to get the resources that they need. So they use drug abuse to maybe try and self-medicate a little bit. And then you have the flip side of it where maybe you abuse drugs or alcohol and maybe that causes some mental health. And both of those things gone untreated, it's pretty hard not only for them to deal with, but then they end up causing issues for other people, and then they don't like that inconvenience, so then they call law enforcement, and we have to deal with it. And the biggest part, especially in Wisconsin, now they're making some progress with the last budget. They earmarked some money to come to this region of the state to assist with that, but I'm sure Mark's going to talk about it too, but one of the biggest things with mental health, biggest issues, is if we feel someone is such a danger to themselves or somebody else that we have to take them into secure detention, basically take their rights away, to take them to treatment, basically, to get some help. We put them in belly chains and handcuffs in the back of a police car and transport them 5 hours one way to Oshkosh, Winnebago Health, which is the state hospital. 5 hours away from their family support, 5 hours away from their friends, 5 hours away from any sort of assistance that they may have been in, right? You're 5 hours away. If you were in counseling, you're 5 hours away. And then we drop them off and we leave them there. So 2 days later, when the court says, yeah, there's not enough to hold them, they're on their own to get back. So somebody already with limited resources now is 5 hours away from any support that they have, and then they're just kicked out of the hospital and milling the streets of Oshkosh until they can find a way back home. So that's a big problem. I think another part of that, a caveat to that, is I don't think that there's enough treatment facilities or treatment professionals to help everybody that needs mental health help. You know, there's a statistic out there, and I'm not going to butcher it by guessing, but it's way low from from what I would think it would be. I would think that almost everybody at some point in time is in need of some kind of mental health counseling or assistance, right? Someone deals with a death of a close family member. Without some proper guidance in how to deal with that, you're probably not going to come through it on the other end. Now, if you have, many of us, I'm sure, have great family networks and great support networks where you can talk through that with your loved ones. A lot of people don't have that, so they have to try and do it by themselves. So I think those are obviously the two main issues that we see. And I don't know that we're going to fix it anytime soon, but awareness to that, right, from when we're responding to something, is someone could be having a really bad day, and you don't know that person, but you have to understand that they're probably going through a difficult time, and we'll probably talk about that later on with some of the de-escalation questions, but you just have to understand that everybody's got a story, and you might be the only person that can help them through that story. So.
Yeah, I completely agree with Chief Willems. The mental health side of things has been one of the most difficult challenges, and I know that you hear a lot about it in the media. And to that aspect, I think there's a lot of good information out there in the fact that mental health is a big problem. You mentioned the fact that it goes hand in hand with drug and alcohol abuse. There are so many times that we'll take somebody to the hospital for medical clearance, and they're maybe at a 0.4. So the legal limit for driving is an 0.8. These people are at a 0.4 because they're either self-medicating or they're trying to overcome whatever is in their mind. And they're making comments of suicide or self-harm, but then maybe when they get down to a 0.04 or they're sober, that's not in their mindset anymore. So we have to try to balance that out. And then for us as law enforcement, so here's the predicament that we're in. In the state of Wisconsin, by law, we are the ones that have to do an emergency detention on somebody, to detain them for up to 72 hours for a mental health hold. That's a job that neither one of us want. It's given to us by the state. So if there is some way that we can make some adjustments, in the state of Minnesota, literally across the river, ER doc, an emergency room doctor, can do a mental health hold. In Wisconsin, they can't. It has to be law enforcement in kind of cooperation with the mental health or the behavioral health through your county, but ultimately it's law enforcement's decision on whether or not you're going to put somebody into a mental health hold. Not something we get a ton of training about, and there's a lot of talk about, wouldn't you be happy if a social worker would come alongside you? Absolutely. They are the ones that have the training. They are the ones that do that work. We would be more than happy if there's a system that's in place, realizing that if it's safe, which is why we often go and why we're the first ones to show up. But at some point, and it's a safe scenario, we'd be more than happy to leave and let them continue on with the assessments and talking to the people and trying to figure out what their best needs are. Because what ends up happening is we'll go to the hospital with a person that's in crisis. They have to be medically cleared in order to be accepted by a facility that has a secure psychiatric ward. That can take 3 hours. That can take 12 hours. If they're intoxicated, oftentimes it can take longer than that because the hospital that's accepting them won't accept until they're at a certain BAC or blood alcohol concentration. So we're now having one officer sitting in a hospital, watching over, babysitting, however you want to call it, for 12 hours, paying them now potentially overtime or having to swap out people. And the expectation is currently, because the hospitals don't have the room around here, that we're taking a 4.5, 5 hour drive across the state, dropping them off, and then a 4.5, 5 hour drive back home. Paying the officers, all of the expenses for the squads and the gas and all those types of things, where if we had something that was more local, which, like Jeff mentioned, the state finally came through. They're putting $15 million into the Eau Claire hospital system to try to capture adult and juvenile beds for us to be able to get those people in crisis. The other thing that St. Croix County did a great job of many years ago, I would say probably 10 years ago now, is that they brought in a process through Northwest Connections where they had somebody that came in and did some kind of early look at whether it was a scene response or maybe instead of hospitalizing them, they could go into a safety plan. And so what it ended up doing was it shortened the amount of stay, or it shortened the amount of times that we sent people where maybe they went for a day or two and then were released. And what it really did was those people that really needed it, those beds were available for them. But typically those people were longer stays. So that means those beds aren't on a cycle anymore. They are kind of clogged up, and so now we don't have as much availability. So the system has its own problems, and we can't solve that as law enforcement. We can't do a lot about that. But I can tell you that for a person in mental health, and Jeff mentioned it exactly right, you place them in handcuffs because we have to make sure that we're safe. We have to make sure they're safe and they're not going to hurt themselves in our squad car on the ride to Winnebago. So you put a person in crisis in handcuffs, you drive 4.5 hours in the back of a squad car in a confined space, and then you drop them off with no resources, no transportation back, and the system doesn't work perfectly. So, but we're only a piece of that system, and we do our best to try to figure that out.
There's talk of a community resource officer for Hudson. We also have school liaison officers, something I didn't grow up with. Tell us what those officers do and how it is different from the traditional role.
Hi, so yeah, there we go. We'll start with the police liaison officers, right? So that position was designed to be in the schools to build relationships with the students and the staff, teachers, primarily the students, right? To be there as a resource, to be there as a friend, to be there as someone a student could talk to essentially build relationships between law enforcement and the students, right? Because if you're going to affect change, you have to start with kids, generally. So that was kind of the premise behind that. So now the city has one in the high schools, and then the high school, and then one also in the middle school that tries as much as they can to get into the elementary schools. With 5 elementary schools and the biggest middle school in the state, and that's a lot of people that person has to reach out and touch. So it's difficult. As for this new community engagement officer, the design behind that was similar as a school resource officer. A lot of people hear the term community service officer, where you see maybe in Woodbury or in Blaine or somewhere in the cities where they have an unarmed, non-sworn person that helps with traffic control or takes animal complaints and deals with barking dog complaints and things like that, right? Helps Public Works set up barricades for road closures on parades or bike races or 5Ks, right? This position for Hudson is going to be a sworn position, and much like a school resource officer, the design is to be out in the community building relationships with community members, getting to know the business owners, getting to know the neighborhood leaders, being involved in the many events that the city has every year. So any given summer outside of COVID, the city has some sort of an event taking place nearly every weekend, especially in the summer. We have the hot air fair in the wintertime. We have 5K races and bike races throughout the year. So this position will be, those are all community events, right? So this position will be basically infiltrate themselves into those processes to be the go-between or the liaison, basically a community liaison with the police department to make sure that everything runs smoothly. They have to be sworn because you can't direct traffic legally if you're not. You can't do a lot of things legally if you're not sworn. So to get the full impact of a position like that, it has to be sworn. The primary duties, I would say 95% of what they will be doing, they will be meeting with neighborhood leaders, church leaders, faith leaders, business leaders, and just people that run these community events, people that know what's going on in their neighborhoods. If there are issues going on that need to be addressed, that's a great way to spear a neighborhood meeting where people can come and voice their concerns, whether it's concerns of just in society in that neighborhood or whether it's concerns with the police department or whatever. But it's all about building trusting relationships with the community. Do you have anything to add to that?
So if we haven't described it well enough yet, the Village of North Hudson and the City of Hudson are 2 separate entities. We share fire, we share EMS. Well, the whole area shares EMS now. But one of the things that North Hudson has done, and the City of Hudson as well, is utilizing those contacts with the the fifth graders through the programming and some of the things that we do to try to get in and talk to kids. When I first took over as chief back in 2005, the previous chief, Rich Jansen, was still alive. He was actually dying of cancer, and so I went and talked to him. And one of the things I said to him was, how am I going to be successful at this job? And he basically said, build relationships with kids, never lie to kids, because kids become adults and they will remember. And so we try really hard to work with kids. We don't have in North Hudson a school resource officer, but we utilize the cities when they come in to help at the elementary school, and then we send our officers in to talk to them, because when we started the programming, it's amazing how that relationship has changed and how our juvenile crime and just the little petty things, the spray painting on buildings and all those types of things, those just declined, because I think they realized that we were out there trying to help people. They would come to us and tell us things that we didn't know before, because they wanted to make sure their community was safe, and they knew that we were now somebody they could talk to. Just like I hope after tonight you get a different perspective of who we are as people and not just the uniform that we wear.
We hear terms like de-escalation and excessive use of force in the media. Can you discuss what those terms mean to you and your department?
Yeah, so de-escalation. It's been a hot topic in the media in the last year or so. Literally, the City of Hudson Police Department had 15,000 contacts with the public last year. In 2020, and that was during a COVID year. Literally, every single thing we do requires some sort of de-escalation. Everything. Nobody's ever happy to call the police. They're calling it because they're in crisis or someone's causing them a problem. Everything we do requires de-escalation. So de-escalation is huge. It's part of our job. We train to it. We train crisis intervention, which is a 40-hour class, dealing with people in crisis. There are refreshers on that every couple of years that we take. Every department member on mine, I'm pretty sure on North Hudson's Police Department too, as well as St. Croix County Sheriff's Department, is trained in crisis intervention, de-escalation. A lot of this goes with years of experience too. The more you work with people, the more you have to de-escalate situations, the better you get. Obviously, someone with 20 years, 21 years of law enforcement experience is going to be better than someone right out of the recruit academy, right out of college, with less than a year on the job. But that's why we're fortunate in Hudson, where on a crisis call like that, we're going to have more than one officer available. And it's not beyond somebody with a little bit more experience to say, just kind of step in and take over the de-escalation practice. Now, just like everything else in the world, nothing is absolute, right? So de-escalation is not going to work every single time. But if you go on the FBI's crime stats, right, you can see that law enforcement in this country generally is attacked with a knife or a gun 17,000 times on average per year. In 1,000 cases, somebody dies at the hands of police, right? Officers are attacked with other weapons or body parts, right, fists, legs, over 48,000 times a year. Still, in only 1,000 of those cases, on average, does someone die at the hands of the police. There are over 380 million contacts in this country with law enforcement and the public. 380 million in a year. And in 1,000 of those cases, people die at the hands of the police. I'm a little bit biased, but I would make the argument that there is nobody better in this country at de-escalation than American law enforcement, because there's about 800,000 of us in the country, and that's all we do every day. That kind of piggybacks onto the use of force in the media and kind of correlates to what Mark was talking about in his opening statement, is that the media it's not really our friend, right? They're trying to sell ratings, they're trying to sell news. They're not going to report every time the whole story. And even when a body camera video from a tragic event involving a law enforcement death or a custodial death is released, you're getting a 10-second snippet of it. You're not getting the before and the after. And we'll talk about that a little more later on with body cameras, but you've got to be able to sit and let all the facts come in and analyze the facts for what they are, as facts. Not putting in your own biases, not putting in your own assumptions, and quite frankly, not judging the officer before we know all the facts. That's quite frankly not fair. Everybody else is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Law enforcement also should be presumed innocent until proven guilty. And there is nobody more than Mark and I that if an officer steps out of line and breaks the law, they should be held accountable. That's what our job is to hold our guys and gals accountable for our high standards. So we hold ourselves, and I know Mark, I worked with him for 5 years. He was my training officer. He's my chief for a little bit. We hold our standards very high. Very, very high, the highest possible standard. So I would urge you all to, yes, hold us to a high standard, the absolute highest standard. And I've said this before, but don't hold us to a double standard.
So I'll build a little bit on Jeff's answer. And one of the things when I was thinking about this answer is, contrary to popular belief, force is a last resort. We don't get out of the car hoping to have to use our baton. I've never pulled my baton off my duty belt in 21 years because it's just not a tool I really enjoy. It just seems like a very, if I lose it, I'm gonna end up getting beat with it. So there's certain tools that we don't like to use I'm not telling that one. In 21 years, in 20 years on North Hudson, we've had tasers since 2016, I believe, is when we instituted tasers. Actually, you were still there. When did you leave North Hudson? Seven? Okay, so maybe 2006. That's where I was thinking of the six. 2006, we instituted tasers on our department. Since 2006, we have utilized a taser once. So we don't start here. We try to start here. There's times that it's just impossible. When you think of de-escalation, and I've gone through the train the trainer, so I teach de-escalation to my officers. When you think about, there are times where we just can't start with a conversation and trying to talk people down. If I get out of a car and someone runs at me with a knife, I can talk all I want. I'm probably not going to change their mind. I'm probably going to have to raise to a different level of force. If I get to a school shooting, I'm not going to try to make a phone call and try to negotiate. We have to get in and stop the threat. And so a lot of times that's difficult for people to understand because they think that's where we start. They think we get out of the car and we have our guns out and we're ready to do whatever we need to do. No, we're out of the car and trying to get information. We're trying to figure out what's going on with that situation so we don't have to use force. We want to use the least amount of force possible. When you look at the training and experience, Jeff talked a lot about that. We work in small communities. We deal with the same people over and over again. I would probably say that 98%, well, maybe 97% of our calls are a lot of the same people, that they're in crisis, they're doing something wrong, they haven't really learned their lesson, and so you get to know those people. And so when you show up on scene, you probably already have a relationship. What that relationship means to them versus what it means to me might be different. They may not like me at all, but at least we've had a conversation, and so we can start at a little bit of a different level. When we have victims, if we've dealt with them before, maybe it's a domestic situation where it's the third time we're at that house, we know some of the background, and so we don't have to start at the ground level. So we can kind of build in those relationships, and that helps us with not having to rise to that high level of force in a lot of these situations. I think one of the things when we talk about the excessive use of force is exactly what Jeff was talking about. It's excessive. It's those officers that are doing more than they need to, and they're not backing it down. We're taught, we're trained to use the amount of force necessary to stop a threat or to control a situation, and then back it down to the appropriate level to keep control over that situation. So there's a lot of times that people just, if they're using excessive force, we're going to be the first ones that are going to be talking with that officer, putting them on suspension, and possibly removing them from our agencies. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we're human. I think I dropped that in a little bit earlier. But one of the courses that I went to is the Force Science program at the Force Science Institute, and they talk a lot about how officers are human and we react as humans. So one of the things that you oftentimes hear in the media, and I'll say that you're predisposed to a set of facts because of a headline or whatnot, but if an officer shoots, or if an officer's shot hits a person in the back, then people's thought process must be they must have planned to shoot the person in the back. Well, Force Science has done a number of different studies on how long it takes a person to turn from forward-facing, to turn, to run, and get away. There's tons of scientific statistics about time, and it might have been because everything takes time. For an officer to make a decision to pull the trigger, it takes about 2.5 seconds. It also takes time to stop that decision making. So if a person has a weapon, they tell them to drop it, drop it, drop it, they don't drop it, and all of a sudden they drop it. If the officer has made a decision at some point that they are going to use deadly force and the person drops it, there is time where that officer has to comply or understand that the weapon has been dropped to stop the trigger pull, and sometimes that doesn't work. So that's kind of the bad scenario. But it also might mean they've fired 2 shots, the person turned and is running away. It takes time for them to stop the impression on their finger to continue to pull. So you may have 5, 6 shots fired. In the media, and you hear a lot of people saying, oh my God, they shot 5 or 6 times. Well, yes, but at the time that they decided to stop, that they had the threat was gone, but it still takes some time. So it's hard to kind of put a number to that, and really until you get the entire investigation and when they decided to stop shooting. But a lot of times you'll see that a person may be shot in the back. That was not, I won't say was not. The probability that that was the intent of the officer to shoot the person in the back is really, really low. It probably was a dynamic situation. People move, and obviously there's a lot going on in those types of situations. So everything takes time. And yeah, I think I'm good with that one. Thank you.
Do your departments have body cameras? If so, have they been a benefit to your agency?
Yeah, that's a really good question, too. Thanks for that one. We do have body cameras. We also have squad cameras at the Hudson Police Department. The funny thing is, excuse me, funny thing is when we first implemented body cameras back in 2014, the officers didn't like the idea. Like, they thought we as administrators were just going to be sitting in our office all day watching body cameras from the night before and picking apart everything they were doing, right? It did not take a lot of time for them to fall in love with the body cameras. Because if anything, it's a security measure for them, right? Now, to go along with that, a body camera is a small little lens. It's a wide angle, but it doesn't capture everything that the human eye can see, right? So it's a huge benefit, it's a huge asset to not only law enforcement, but the community as well, but it has its limitations. A body camera cannot see what's happening over there or behind you. Whereas your peripheral vision, the things you hear, the things you smell, the things the things you feel, through a, I don't know, for lack of a better term, a sixth sense, right? None of that is recorded in the body camera. It's just what you see. But in every situation, there's other factors at play, there's other things going on that the officer has to be able to articulate, or that a witness has to be able to articulate. So they're a great tool. I think they're a necessary tool. We've had them for a long time now, and they've been a huge benefit to us, but they do have their limitations.
North Hudson PD also has body cameras. I'm wearing ours right now, and we do have cameras in our squad cars. When I went through the Force Science training, we talked a lot about cameras and how important they are and how great of a tool they are, but definitely the fact that they are not the end-all, be-all of a situation. They oftentimes will give us a lot of good information, and we saw it recently. It was Arcadia, or Caledonia PD in Wisconsin just recently, where because of multiple body cameras and watching the entire thing, you really got a value of what actually occurred in that situation, when again, sometimes the media can shorten those body cameras. My example that I often give, and Jeff's exactly right, initially the officers were really hesitant. It's Big Brother. They thought I had the time to sit and watch 24 hours of camera recordings or whatnot from different events. I wish I had the time. That's not something that I put a lot of priority on unless it's needed, and then we will review it. We do a lot of review when I'm watching it through for cases to see what an officer did right, what an officer could do differently next time, and we deal a lot with that during the training aspect of it. But I remember the first time that I had a citizen complaint. It was an argument that occurred in an apartment building, 2 women, 1 man. The gentleman was highly intoxicated. There was an argument that ensued. They called the police to get him to leave. Prior to arrival, the male subject had left, and the officer interviewed the 2 females that were at the scene. He talked to both of them. He got independent stories from each one of them. They were very much alike. And it happened to be that the male was the boyfriend of one of the females. He was on probation, not supposed to be drinking, so was going to probably get in some trouble for the fact that he was drinking. She came down the next day, asked for a copy of the police report. It was an open records request. We gave her a copy of the police report. No one wasn't arrested at that point. And she left for about an hour. I came back, asked to speak with me. She came in my office and said, "Chief, I have a problem. This report that you have is inaccurate. Your officer did not write down the information accurately. Everything that he says I said was actually this other girl." Well, of course, the person that I'm talking to is the girlfriend of the person that might get in trouble. And so she said, no, it was the other girl that said all those things. And I said, okay, well, let me look through that, and I'll get back to you. So about 25 minutes later, I called her back, and I said, would you please come in and chat with me? I said, when she sat down, I said, here, let me just show you this. And I turned my screen, and I played the officer's body cam video. And about 6 seconds into it, she went, I'm really sorry, I did say those things, but I don't want my boyfriend to be upset with me because he's going to get in trouble because of the words that I said. Now that saved me, that 25 minutes or whatever, saved me a week's worth of work of interviewing the officer, interviewing both women, potentially trying to interview the male, and get their versions, and then it's a he said, she said, or she said, and it saved all that time, and that officer, I didn't have to call him in on his time off, I didn't have to do those interviews, and so there are really real benefits to having that third-party, kind of non-emotional aspect of our jobs. But exactly as Jeff mentioned, it is a singular view. It can't see to the side. It can't feel things. It can't catch things. And it really is a view this direction. I don't know if any of you have seen the invisible gorilla experiment video. I don't have a screen here to show you, but basically what it is, it's a video of 2 teams, one where like maybe 12 people, 6 to a side. One has all white shirts on, the other has all black shirts on, and the instructions are, and they have a basketball, or several basketballs, and the instructions are something to the effect of count how many times the basketball gets passed between the people in white. And so they start playing the video, and it plays, I think it's about 25 or 30 seconds, and at the end they say, okay, how many times was it passed? And when I show it to the kids in the elementary school, or I show it to citizen groups, you get answers 13, 14, 15, and they're all really worried about that time or that number. And then you say, okay, how many of you saw the gorilla? And you get people that go sheet white, and then you play it back for them. In the middle of this video, a man in a gorilla suit walks through, or a person walks through, turns, beats their chest, and then walks off frame. People don't see this huge dark gorilla walk through the screen because they're focused, because they were told to focus on the bouncing of the ball. That happens a lot when officers get to a scene, when they're getting information from dispatch. They get to a scene, they have what they think are good facts, and it's nothing against dispatch. There's a whole bunch of factors that come into play that oftentimes they get focused on something and they might miss something else that happened. Or they get so focused on a weapon or something else going on, they may not see another threat. They may not see a citizen that's trying to give them information. There's a lot of visual things that they have to try to take into place. And so we talk a lot about that. I'll ask you, if you know, how many white cars did you pass on your way here today? Anybody know? Maybe just from home to here, or wherever your last were to here. I don't understand why you don't know. You saw everything that you were driving past, right? I don't understand why you can't tell me. How many white cars did you see? That's the thing. Your memory, you take in only those certain things that you need to. There's so many things that we let go out of our brains. I have officers that come to me often, they start talking about things. I was like, you know what, I don't have room for that. You're gonna have to deal with that. I've got this much in my brain, that's all I can handle. But, and our kids do that to us all the time too. Hey mom, hey dad, you try to just blank out some of that out. But we take in so much every day that we just don't hang on to. And so there's certain things when we're trying to ask an officer, ask a witness. I mean, witnesses are great, but we can honestly tell you that you could have two people looking at the exact same scenario. Because they bring something from themselves to that scenario, that's what they're going to capture, and they may not have seen the same information. So the officers are the same way. And I guess the last thing I'll throw into this one, I've got a lot more, but I don't want to be the one that overstays my welcome, is that trust cannot be excluded. When you talk about body cameras, there was a day when there weren't body cameras in this world, and officers were given the trust that the information that they were providing was true and accurate to the best of their ability. And I think we still have to hold on to the fact that officers are human, and they will remember the things that they'll remember and they won't capture. So the body cameras are great, but they're not the end-all be-all.
Do police officers have a bias?
Yes. Police officers are human beings, right? Every human being has biases. They're implicit biases or explicit biases. A lot has been made of implicit bias training too in the past, 10 years, right? Yeah, absolutely every person walking this earth has biases. Police officers are no different. But understanding what your biases are and not letting those impact your decision making, that's where it becomes important, right? Not having explicit biases, those are a bigger issue, I think, because those are biases that you're acting upon, and you don't want to do that. You don't want anybody to do that. But everybody has got implicit biases. You have to be aware of those implicit biases, and you can't let those impact your decision making. And that's where the importance is, in my mind.
And I agree. We definitely have biases, and we bring it to everything that we have. If anybody's interested, there's a book called Biased that I read recently. It's by Jennifer Eberhardt. She's a PhD she works in colleges in California. It was a really interesting read for me, and I started reading it. My wife read it first and said, I know you as an officer. I think this is something that you need to take a look at. I read it and found it to be incredibly eye-opening because of a number of different things that she talks about in her book. Now, we all have bias. There's nothing we can do about certain parts of them, but some of them come from places that we never even understood. Societal things, the way that society sets certain things up. The communities that we live in. I mean, if you live in a community that's pretty much homogeneous, you have a certain set of biases because you just don't know. You've never experienced other cultures, other areas that people live in. And so you kind of bring whatever you think is normal to you to that setting. And so I think the biggest thing in law enforcement that we can look at, and she talks a lot about how the system is as much of a problem as any law enforcement officer is, that it's really a bigger picture and we're just a small cog in that wheel. But really, as Jeff mentions, it's acknowledging that you have it and learning to change or learning to adapt to other people and other perspectives.
What training or tools would help young officers entering the profession?
Well, I think the state of Wisconsin's been trying to figure that out for the last 100 years, right? I mean, when Mark and I went through the recruit academy to become a police officer, it was 400 hours of training. Now it's 720 hours of training before an officer can be certified to work as a law enforcement officer. I think a lot of things contribute to an officer's success when they're getting started. Obviously, their training, right? But their upbringing, their education, their life experiences. I've hired a lot of people in the last, 5 years or so. Marcus hired a lot of people. And what I've seen is, yeah, you can go to college But if you live in mom and dad's basement while you're going to college and you don't have a job and you don't really do anything other than go to school, come home, go back into the basement, go back to school, come home, go back into the basement, your life experience is peanuts compared to someone that had to work to put themselves through college, someone that was involved in group activities throughout high school, team sports or clubs or whatever, where they had to socially interact with other people and problem solve. So I think someone's life experience is sometimes the best training someone can have when getting into law enforcement, because you bring all that with you. You bring all your life experiences, you bring your previous experiences and what's worked and what didn't work with you to the table. And then when you want to become a police officer, you're put through the 720-hour training, which you have to have some college coursework before you can do that. You have to have 60 college credits in the state of Wisconsin. You don't have to have a degree, but you have to have shown an interest in furthering your education, right? But what's most important is the ongoing training that the officer has once they're employed. So in the city of Hudson, we do a training day every month, and it's a variety of different things. We do scenario-based training. We do scenario-based training virtually every time except for the state-required qualification courses. Those are set by statute and the Training and Standards Board, and to keep our certification, we have to do those every year or every other year, depending on what the training is. But for the other 10 training days, it's crisis intervention, it's first aid, it's CPR, it's any litany of things that we will deal with on the street that we're training our officers every month, every year, as they go. So obviously, again, as more time goes, the better person, the better police officer you become with the extra training and the extra time, because a lot of the training that we get, quite frankly, is on the street, is dealing with people, and you have to figure it out, right? You're kind of being thrown when you start off, and I still remember the first day I got off of FTO. I was scared out of my pants to go to work by myself that day. Because I get out of the recruit academy, and it's like, yeah, I can do this job. This isn't that big of a deal. And then you start FTO, and it's like, man, I know nothing about what's going on out here. And now you're alone. And I was in North Hudson. I was all by myself. I didn't have backup. I didn't have the luxury of 3 or 4 other officers working with me at the same time. So you go to a call, and you're it. And all eyes are on you. You got to figure it out. You're kind of jumping in both feet. Yeah. A field training program. So it's field training program is basically where a new officer rides with an experienced trained FTO, field trainer, and they have to go through different tasks. Every task pretty much that a law enforcement officer is going to encounter, they have to be shown how to handle that task appropriately, and then they practice it until they show proficiency or what they feel and the trainer feels is proficiency, and then they own that task. So the next time that officer gets dispatched to a similar call that he's signed off on a task, it's all his, and then he's being evaluated on how he performed by the FTO. And that process is anywhere from 8 to 10 weeks, give or take. 4 months. It's been a while since I did training. It's a long time. But training never stops. For a law enforcement officer in the state of Wisconsin and in Minnesota, quite frankly, we're required a minimum of 24 hours of continuing education training in order to keep our certification. The average number of hours my officers spend in training is about 100 per officer per year. So the training never stops. So just because they give you a baseline when you get out of the recruit academy, but the training never stops from there.
And I'll just add a real quick, I guess the tool that I would like to see is more realistic scenario-based training. I've had officers that come out of the recruit academy, they get hired by us right away, and we have good conversations about what was that like? Because a lot of times it's hard for them to transition the books stuff that they did into real life. And one of the conversations I had with an officer was, tell me about your scenario base, because in order to test out of the current 720 hour, you have to go through several scenarios where you have to show proficiency based on the training that they've given you. Well, the scenarios are put through by people that they've worked with their entire, 720 hours, might be other students. Typically, it's the instructors that come in and they're role players. They play the bad guy or they play the victim. And when they're talking to me, and I had an officer that left. He worked for me for 2.5 months, and he had an incident where he had to wrestle with a guy. And he basically said, this isn't what I expected it to be. And so we talked a little bit about, after he had made the decision, I wasn't going to change his mind, we talked a little bit about what would you have liked to have seen differently. And he said, I never felt scared. I never felt out of control or not in control during those scenarios because it was John Doe, my instructor from 3 hours ago. I knew he wasn't going to hurt me. Where every day when we put on this uniform, we have to expect that somebody might try to hurt us. And so it wasn't realistic for him. And then the other one that's a little bit more comical is I wish that they would train at night. Because I don't know how many times I've had new officers get out, walk up to a car without a flashlight in their hand and expect that they can just see what's going on because they never put a flashlight in their hand in training. And so the realistic side of those scenarios to be able to say, you can't see in the dark, neither can I, use the tools that we give you. But I agree with Jeff. I think that the ongoing training, we do want monthly trainings, and I think that's really important because it helps build a team setting for us as well as just make sure that we're utilizing those skills. Because just like anybody else, if you don't use them, you lose them.
What can community members do to make our community healthier and stronger? Actions that ultimately make your jobs easier.
Oh boy, a Dr. Phil moment, huh? I guess, geez, the big one for me is just, treat people with respect and dignity. Treat everybody with respect and dignity. Get to know the people that you live by. Get to know the people that own the businesses that you shop at. Because if you have a relationship with somebody, it's a lot harder to do something bad to that relationship, right? So I think it kind of goes back to the Middle Ages about relationships. I mean, everything is built on relationships. So especially for a community our size, there should be no excuse why we don't have better relationships within our own community. So that's what I would say. And actions that ultimately would make our jobs easier. Man, understand that we're human too. We're going to make mistakes. We're not meaning any harm by anything that we do. We're just trying to do the best that we can with whatever situation we're thrust into. We don't have all the answers, though most of the time when people call police, they're expecting all the answers. And then they may not like those answers, and then we go back to where we started from. But I would say, just giving us the benefit of the doubt if something goes bad, especially if you live in this community, if you work in this community, give us the due process, give us the benefit, because you can trust me. If someone screws up, they're going to be held accountable. Our goal is for never to make a mistake, right? The chase of perfection, even though perfection is not attainable, right? Maybe you can catch excellence. Vince Lombardi quote. But as far as the actions that could make our jobs easier, I would say just try to treat everybody with respect and dignity. Work on your interpersonal relationships with the people that are close to you and the places where you spend time at, and then just give us the benefit of the doubt.
I'm going to throw out a couple of really quick, very specific ones. Don't tell your 5-year-old I'm going to arrest them if they don't wear their seatbelt. I'm not. But that starts that relationship building, and it starts that impression that they're bad, they're going to hurt us, they're going to do something to us. So just don't tell them we're going to do that. Try to work through problems with your neighbors. I think, one of the things that oftentimes if we have a neighbor or someone that calls us and says, my neighbor's dog is barking, it's bothering me, it's been going on for 2 hours, I ask my officers to say the first question is, have you talked to them? Have you reached out to your neighbor? Because I can tell you, it's going to be a much different conversation if you go over and talk to your neighbor and explain what you've got going on than if a guy in uniform or a girl in uniform shows up and has this authoritative, perspective to it about the ordinance that they might have violated. So try to just have that conversation with your neighbor, because we've come a long way from being kind of in our silos and being very secluded in our homes, and it's much nicer when we can get out and talk to our neighbors. The other thing that we'll do is it'll also make sure that you know if something weird is going on in your neighborhood. We had a situation not too long ago where there was a car that was parked, and I had 4 people call me from that neighborhood and say, we don't know who the car is. We talked to Joe. Joe talked to Susie. Susie, none of us know who this car belongs to. We're really concerned about it. That's fantastic, because I know now going into that neighborhood that there's probably something not right with this car, versus the one person that calls and it happens to be Joe's daughter who's in from out of town that happened to park there, and now we're again showing up at a door going, what's with this car? Well, that's supposed to be there. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing suspicious about it. So just have those conversations with your neighbors before something really bad happens. I think the other one that my wife and I talk about a lot is don't make an assumption that somebody else called the police. If you drive past a crash, call. We'd rather get 6 calls about a crash than 0 and have that person that might be in trauma or having a problem with might have been a medical situation on why they crashed. Just call 911, have that conversation. The dispatcher might tell you, yep, we've got calls on it, thanks for calling, and let you go. But don't make the assumption that somebody else called if there's a problem going on. That's it.
We did have a few more questions, but I was told we're supposed to wrap up by 7 o'clock. So would you like to make any other comments before we wrap up? Anything else you'd like to share?
Yes, I'm the chatty one. No, I just wanted to thank you all for coming. I heard some laughter tonight. I tried not to make, and my wife and I talked about this, I tried not to make my conversation very dark and all about the bad stuff and whatnot, but I think some of that stuff explains why we are who we are sometimes. But I'm glad that you got a chance to laugh a little bit tonight. I want to thank you all for spending an hour with us. We spent a lot of time considering this. We had lunch last week, which was nice because we caught up. As you mentioned, we were co-workers for a long time, and we still work well together as the two communities that we work in to make sure that the crime in this area is brought down as much as we can. So thank you.
Yep, nope, and I'd just like to echo that. Thanks for showing an interest. It's nice to see a lot of faces out here that I recognize. So that helps me when I'm up here saying, man, if they really care, why aren't they showing up? Well, you showed up, so I appreciate that.
Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. We hope you can come to our next Voices in the Valley. It hasn't been scheduled yet. And thank you to you both. It was very valuable, very good discussion. Thank you.